Good afternoon, everyone. I kindly ask you to put on your headsets, otherwise this is going to be very quiet for you. I don't see many people wearing them yet, so we'll wait another minute so we can officially start this session. Okay, I think some people are wearing them now. They should be on your chair, so all of you should have one. All right. A warm welcome from my side, and good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've had a great time at ChangeNOW already. All right. So we'll have a session on rethinking economics, putting justice and equality first today. For decades, economic growth, measured almost exclusively through GDP, has been the primary indicator for success for countries, for communities, for companies. But what if that measure is not incomplete, but deeply flawed? What if, in chasing endless growth, we are undermining the very foundations of our well-being, our ecosystems, and our economies? My name is Mara Steinbrenner. I'm your moderator of this session, and I'm inviting you to rethink the logic of economic systems with us. I ask you to question not just how much we grow, but what we grow, and who benefits and at what costs. This session kicks off with a keynote that critiques the status quo and sets the tone for rethinking existing systems. From there, we'll explore concrete entry points into transformation, from finance and policy to community action and imagination. And finally, we'll hear from one of the most compelling youth voices on the planet, sharing her knowledge from indigenous traditions and movements in the Global South. Together, we'll ask this question: what does a just and regenerative economy really look like, and how do we begin to build it? Having said that, I'm excited to introduce our keynote speaker. He's the Executive Director of the Hot or Cool Institute. A warm welcome to Luis Akenji. I can see he's just being mic'd up, but he's on his way.
Thank you so much. There's a lot of technology these days. I'm not sure I'm very comfortable with it. If you can hear me, put up your thumb, like that thumbs up. Perfect, perfect. It's good to see you all. And welcome to Paris. It's a spring in Paris, the perfect place. And I'm going to talk to you about a revolution. Don't worry, it's not the French Revolution. It's a different kind of revolution, because we all know that a revolution is coming. That's why you're here. It's a question of whether it's a planned revolution or it's a chaotic one that is going to cause a lot of pain and havoc. So my first question for you to hold in mind is, when you think about the future, how is it you think about it, if you think about it at all? Is it just a little tweak in the technology and the way we live today, or it's a radically transformed future that is quite different from what we have today? That is what we are going to explore over the next 18 minutes. And the work I'll be showing you is, as you all know, we're in 2050. It's spring 2050. That's why it feels a lot more comfortable than it was in 2025. And one way of understanding this is to go with the press. What is the press saying this spring 2050? And don't worry, the press has become a lot more honest now and reflective of what society is. I'm not showing you Fox News, right? So the first thing you would see is that one of the islands that got submerged under the sea because of sea level rise has actually been welcomed by Holland, and they've given it its own autonomous region where the people can live. So it's not just individual climate migration as we thought of in 2025, it's an entire island that has moved, right? The experiment China was playing around with, sponge cities that are much more resilient, opening room in cities for water to flow, removing all the concrete, and all the asphalt and pavement, has really been very successful, much more than people realize. And as such, Chinese cities are so much more resilient that lots of Europeans and Americans are beginning to copy it, right? And for those of you that came from Amsterdam, I'm sure you saw the exhibition of what the wild 20s and the 30s looked like before we got to where we are in 2050. And in fact, if you've not seen it, after this, just go downstairs. There's a similar exhibition of what ideas for 2050 did look like. And as Costa Rica is showing us very clearly, citizen assemblies actually work. We know that they work because the Citizen Assembly of Costa Rica recently vetoed the budget of its government because it did not reflect their well-being objectives. So society has actually changed. Now, let me take you a bit closer to my city. The map looks like a typical map you would have seen in 2025, except instead of seeing its economic productivity, we're measuring something else in my city. We're measuring whether the investments by the municipality are causing social tension or are increasing our well-being. So we have a new set of measures now that is quite different, but it's also a bit, there's a lot of rewilding and reclaimed spacing that has happened, and so nature has been welcomed back into the city. We live in closer communities now, urban villages, and there's a lot of sharing. Of course, there's car-free transportation, unlike in 2025 when we had to pay really a high amount to get to the ChangeNOW conference. And if you look very carefully, you will see where we have our citizen assembly hall and our tools library. So you don't have to each house buy a whole set of tools for itself. So it's quite different. But why did this change so much from what we knew in the 2020s and the 2010, right? That is what I'm going to walk you through. And essentially, there was one fundamental thing we needed to do to move away from the C4 solutions, corporate capture of climate change solutions. That is because, as this diagram would tell you, in the 20s, the Hot or Cool Institute did an analysis of people's consumption and lifestyles to understand what the impacts were on climate change and how climate change was affecting people. And what it showed very clearly is that when you look at food, mobility, housing, consumer goods, leisure, and services, we were living way above our carbon budget, and we needed to reduce by significant amounts. And in fact, the magnitude of reductions was so high and the urgency was so much that we needed nothing more than a radical transformation, not only in terms of carbon, but also in terms of inequality. Because as you would see from this analysis, on the one side, it's a bunch of countries that sat enjoying all the luxuries like we did enjoy in Paris at the time. And on the other side was a bunch of supplying countries that sent stuff over to us so that we can sit and consume. That had to change if we had to get a tenable world and a tenable future. And in fact, as we got to discover very clearly, it was the top 10% of consumers around the world that were causing this climate change problem. And so, of course, there were lots of protests, and the youth just refused to allow their future to be sacrificed. And so, here we are in Paris. We know a little bit about revolutions in France, and we've seen it in history. And we know that the conditions were already set for another revolution. We had to act, or we'll have our hand forced. One thing that became very clear is that we cannot deal with climate change, or we could not deal with climate change just as a technical problem where we throw technical solutions at it. The climate problem was a social problem. It was a problem of inequality, social tensions. The urgency of it also did not allow that we individualize the solutions, but that we deal with it collectively. And that while we were negotiating in the IPCC in terms of national governments, the economic patterns transcended, the economic patterns, environmental consequences, and attitudes transcended national borders. So we needed to widen the scope of responsibility for solutions. And we could not keep pretending about our consumption. We had to address it as part of the problem at the time. So what did we do? We had to break up with our false friends. A few of you are going to get upset now because your grandparents worked for those false friends. But bear with me, just stay there. What is a false friend? It's part of what I call the C4 solutions. If you're creating a so-called solution that cannot be scaled and is just catering to a few people, you're creating niches and you're working for the privileged. If your solution is based on continuing consumerism, you're just feeding into the same system that was creating chaos in the 2030s, in the 2020s. If it did not recognize the urgency of the problem, or if it was delaying meaningful action, then it was a false solution. I'm going to go through a few of these. Those of you that are mad, stay put there. You would see how we overcame this. The first one is our dear friend, the eco-label. just one way of prolonging the issue of consumerism and slapping a sticker on it. If we really did care about unhealthy products and consumptions, we would have kept them outside of the market completely instead of having them in and slapping a sticker on them. The second one is what I call the new Trojan horse, the electric car. We had problems with cars. It wasn't whether it was just electric or fossil fuel. There were problems with cars. We had to change the architecture completely. There was also this wonderful thing where we continued doing exactly the same things. Our companies did exactly the same things they were doing, and then they paid other people far away to compensate them to stay poor, instead of also changing their society. The next one is the very well intended approach to getting our corporations to account for the impact on society, both positive and negative, but allowing so many loopholes that it just became a license to greenwash. And last but not the least, which is probably one of the more painful ones, our governments used to sit at a place called the COP and have negotiations. First, they said it was going to be limited to 1 degree, and then 1.5 degree, and then at some point they started talking about 1.7 degrees, and everyone got mad and said, well, how far are you going to push this? And just as evidence of this, from the first time they released the first climate report to about 40, 50 years later, the problem was getting worse and worse in a much faster way. So this is why we had to break up with our false friends, because as this will show you very, very clearly, we did in fact make improvements in the 2030s, 2020s, and 30s. The energy intensity of our technologies and our products had fallen, which was a really good thing. How much resource we were putting in there had fallen, which was also a very good thing. But our populations were growing, so more people had to consume more of the efficient stuff. And each one of us was consuming a lot more than we did before when things were less efficient. So we were confusing efficiency for sustainability, which is a typical mistake that some people still make these days. And we had to move away from that because the consequence was that we needed overall even more consumption. We were doing even more consumption, and it was creating what is called a rebound effect. And as a consequence, hey, what's up? Everything is up. You know, pollution was increasing, social tension was increasing, the impact of fertilization were getting even worse. And because of that, we needed to move away from most of these approaches and break away from these false friends. What do we have now? In the 2030s, we decided to call it a decade of transformation from private sufficiency to public luxury, from private wealth to private sufficiency and public luxury. What essentially does that mean? I've shown you the example of the cars, right? We knew at the time that we had a car culture. Just look at this analysis that are done by the Hodoku Institute. Cars are predominantly the highest impact areas of our mobility and flying. You can see in the case of Canada, which essentially has a car culture, or in the case of India, that has a motorcycle culture. And our solution to this was to keep producing more cars, but to electrify them. It did not solve the problem because it needed more resources, it had the same labor conditions or even worse, and we're having bigger cars. Even though they were more efficient, so many more people were driving. So the same traffic congestion, the same need for more resources and energy was the problem. And not only that, it was causing global havoc because we were transferring the burden to other parts of the world instead of solving the problem, what I call burden shifting, right? So we needed to move from this individualized idea of car ownership to create public luxury. I've just given this as an example of what happened. Some governments decided in the 2010s, like London, that we're going to set public expectations that you should stop investing in your own private cars. We're going to review speed limits, especially around school systems, cultural centers, to make sure that people get used to the idea of slow driving. We're going to review public transportation routes, introduce new micro-mobility options, and make it a lot more luxurious for people. It's going to be more efficient, it's going to be more effective, it's going to be cleaner, and it's going to be more aware of the fact of why women were not using public transportation. And once we had a few experiments like this, we decided to scale. I'm just going to show you some of those examples of what happened around those periods, right? London started introducing the congestion charge. Heathrow had a lot of protests when they said they could not build new airports. So what did they do? They capped passenger numbers. And by the way, these are newspapers from the 2010s and 20s and the 30s. These are not from 2050, right? Berlin set up bike lanes as temporary ones, but citizens loved them so much that they stayed. Milan turned public spaces that were typically for cars into parking lots and green spaces where people could come and have fun. And of course, Paris, having experienced what walkable cities were, voted that even more streets should become pedestrian friendly, right? The 2040s, we took another approach, the approach of universality. So looking at our fundamental rights and needs as human beings and say, we can still have businesses, but not everything is for profit. How do we change the system? And this is why most of you would remember the COVID pandemic in the 2020s. If you don't remember, your grandparents certainly remember, and they learned a lot of lessons from there, which is why we've reflected them now. But what I want to show you is what billionaire wealth looked like and how it grew during that period. This is done by PricewaterhouseCoopers, so they know what they're talking about. But focus on the period during the COVID pandemic from 2020 April to 2020 July. In 3 months, the wealth of billionaires grew by 27% to $10.2 trillion. Within 3 months, while people were locked and couldn't go beyond their balconies, people were dying. There was inability for some people to even access basic services. There was a lot of wealth accumulation. And where were we making wealth? Off the health of people and off of technology. While Rome burnt, things were going upside down. So you can understand why there needed to be some kind of a change. So we agreed in the decade of the 2030s that we're going to set a social floor. We're not only going to look at reducing emissions, we're going to set a social floor below which people should not fall, so that everyone can have a life of dignity. The question essentially became around then, if you have a fast shrinking carbon budget and the power disparities among countries, among different genders, across different parts of society were so heavy that the competition over the shrinking carbon budget is, how do you distribute it in a way that is fair, that is just, and that is equitable? One of the things we chose to do in terms of consumption was to revisit the choice architecture, especially as it comes to food, mobility, transportation, consumer goods, leisure, and services. The first thing was not just putting eco-labels, but to edit out the harmful consumption options. So essentially we asked, what are the areas that have privatized profits but distributed burden? So private yachts, tourism to space, and all those things got edited out. But we also asked the question, what are the incentives for consumerism? Your frequent flyer miles that took you to Paris at a time, or your consumer loyalty programs, we had to edit those out. But also things like speculative financial investments in fundamental needs became out, no longer an option. But not only that, we had to edit in other aspects, because you don't just take out things. Social innovation, alternative diets, luxurious public transportation, and as well as editing out and editing in, we needed to make sure that there was a level equitable access in society. This is why we capped wealth limits. We capped intergenerational transfer of wealth. We made sure that certain segments of the population did not own more than a certain percentage of national income, just to make sure that there was some kind of equity. But something else started happening going beyond that. When I talk about universality, so you've heard about universal basic services, dividends, universal public services. All of this, whether or not you like them, are trying to apply one thing, the universal principle, the universality principle. Is the reason why we talk about universal human rights, because we all have the same rights. But we had experiments after the Second World War during this period, during which we asked the question, how do we set up healthcare systems in a way that almost everyone has good access to healthcare, and it doesn't depend on how rich you are. So we had universal healthcare in the countries that had learned their lessons, like the UK or most European countries. Unfortunately, not for some parts of North America, but you had universal healthcare. So we thought, why don't we use that lesson and apply it to other areas where we think are quite fundamental? So the area of housing, everyone needs housing, for example. So you can no longer do speculative financial investment in housing. It doesn't mean you can't buy a house. You can buy a house, but you cannot hedge on it just so you can make a profit off of someone else, right? Public transportation, we have non-profit businesses and non-profit provisioning of public transportation, because it's so fundamental to everyone to go meet their grandpa, their friends, their boyfriends and spouses and all whatnot. And for food, we decided to decommodify food and a lot of definancialization in certain areas, because when you have a crunch, actually making profits off of food goes beyond just being an incentive for producing more food. It just becomes a self-fulfilling cycle of profit generation. Right? So the last thing we did in the 2050s, which we're still now playing with, so welcome back to the 2050s, is moving towards the area of global commons. So let's revisit what the newspapers are saying. You remember when our grandparents used to sit in the COP or the climate change meetings and kept postponing the goals? We've learned from that. We no longer just have the United Nations Environment Programme or the IPCC or the UNFCCC. We have a UN Council on Ecological Stability. It learns from all of those, it pulls them together, but it also does something a little bit more. It looks at the powers that the UN Security Council had, and it's mandated the Ecological Stability Council with a lot of this power so that it has authority at beyond national borders. We've also created resource trusts, because there was a lot of discussion around the time about critical minerals and mining and problems associated with it, and what to do with countries that were endowed with these resources, and there was a geopolitical competition on who can sort of can get rights to exploit these resources and who could not. So we've created a global trust that is looking at distribution on a much more equitable basis and other forms of compensation that are actually also making sure that the needs of these countries that are endowed are met without just having very extractive approaches, right? We've also restructured our corporations quite fundamentally. We now have globally extended producer responsibilities. We have different types of corporations, worker-owned corporations. So businesses still exist, as most people assume that the point was that businesses should not exist, but it's a different form of accountability now, and businesses that cater for fundamental needs are quite different from businesses that are catering essentially just for profit generation. And one of the most important things, we decided that the governance architecture that we created in the 1910s, 20s, and the 30s, when we did not have the type of technology that we have now, when the environment was not so much of an issue, when inequality was not so prevalent in society, it was no longer fit for purpose. And so we had to get a new social contract that reflected a new set of rights, that applied a universality approach, that understood how to apply technology in a much more diligent manner, and that essentially revisited what it means to govern and to be governed, and how citizens can participate in this in a way that they actually feel effectively represented. So, given that you were at this conference, ChangeNOW, in the 2020s or in 2025, the question became, what did you do after that to move us towards that 2050 goal or that 2050 world that we had created? Essentially, in going to that conference, there had been a lot of discussion. Is it individual responsibility? Is it an individual company? Is it just a single household? Is it an individual consumer? Is it your responsibility, or it's system change? But what we learned very quickly is that you cannot afford to be an individual. You cannot afford to be an individual company. You cannot afford to be an individual consumer or citizen. We need to work together, and we need to work collectively. Individual change or system change, this is a false dichotomy that we could not afford. And even more, we had to revisit the systems, not just from a position of how they're serving political institutions and aspirations, but how fundamentally they're meeting the needs of everyone, not just a few, and in a way that well-being was optimized across the board. So the question, which I asked at the beginning of this last section, what did you do? You're all sitting here because you know change is going to happen. Again, is it planned or chaotic change? How much pain do we want in that change? Because whether or not you accept it, we are in a competition to shape the future, each and every one of us. We're in a competition to shape the future. Now, who are we competing with? We're competing with people who think we would keep exploiting and feeding the world with fossil fuels. We're competing with a few people that think they can sit over the majority and make decisions over what they should do. We're competing with segments or sectors of society that think they're parts of the world that are just there to dig and cater for their needs and they stay wealthy. We're competing with technology that doesn't care about people, except it just wants to use people to make even more money. And the most important one, we're at a very dangerous precipice where what we consider law for humanity is being exercised in very unfortunate ways. The question then is, what did you do after ChangeNOW 2025? Thank you.
Thank you, Luis.